Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Program Phases in Mental Health Courts webinar. My name is Sarah Wurzberg. I'm a Grantee Technical Assistance Manager for Behavioral Health at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. After the presentations by Norma, Jaeger, and Eric Olson, we will have time for questions and answers. To ask questions, please type the questions into the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We will do our best to answer your questions. If your question does not get answered during the webinar, please follow up via email after the event has ended. At the end of the presentation, we will provide email addresses for everyone who's speaking today. We will also be recording the webinar. The webinar recording and PowerPoint slides will be posted on our website shortly. The Council of State Governments Justice Center is a bipartisan policy solutions organization that serves all three branches of government. The Behavioral Health Division at the Council of State Governments Justice Center does a number of different things, one of which is providing technical assistance to Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Program grantees funded through the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance. We also provide technical assistance to Second Chance Act co-occurring reentry program for adults with co-occurring substance use and mental disorders through the National Reentry Resource Center, also funded through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We have a number of resources on our website on topics such as information sharing, lots of things on different mental health courts, and we also work with other partners on the Stepping Up initiative, which goal is to decrease the prevalence of mental illness in jails. So this is an example of one resource that is available on our website. It is a free multimedia curriculum that helps jurisdictions walk through processes of developing a mental health court, data collection, sustaining that court, and identifying the correct target population. This webinar specifically is a part of the Criminal Justice and Mental Health Court Learning Sites. We have 4 sites that were selected from across the country for the best practices they have in mental health court and diversion work. Today we will hear from Bonneville County, Idaho, which is a mental health court that serves approximately 45 participants per year. It was established in 2002, but you'll hear much more from Norma and Eric on the Bonneville court and the work they do in the state of Idaho. Another resource is the State Standards for Building a Better Mental Health Court. We partnered with the National Center for State Courts in order to develop this document to look at mental health court standards across states. Now for the introductions of our speakers. We have Norma Jaeger, who has spent more than 30 years developing and managing public mental health treatment programs, as well as alcohol and drug prevention and treatment programs throughout the Northwest. She served as the Idaho Supreme Court's statewide drug court and mental health court coordinator for 12 years and continues to work for the Supreme Court in supporting all problem-solving courts throughout the state. She is a former member of the Board of Directors of the National Association of Drug Court Professionals and adjunct professor in the Criminal Justice Department at Boise State University, where she is completing her PhD in Public Policy and Administration. We also have Eric Olson, who is the District Manager for Adult and Juvenile Mental Health Courts in the state of Idaho's 7th Judicial District. He is a licensed clinical professional counselor. He worked closely with community members to start the first mental health court in the state of Idaho, which was selected as one of 5 national learning sites for mental health courts through the U.S. Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, and the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Eric has served as the coordinator for the Bonneville County Mental Health Court since its inception in 2002. He also serves as the coordinator for 4 other mental health courts, including the first 2 juvenile mental health courts in Idaho. Eric has worked specifically on improving integrated treatment and focusing on high-risk participants and how to provide evidence-based treatment to reduce recidivism in mental health courts. We're very excited to have both of them to provide you with some great information on one of our most commonly asked questions, which is how do you go about developing program phases in mental health courts. So with that, I will turn it over to Norma Jaeger.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be a part of this webinar and this learning opportunity, and I'm really excited that people are interested in the development and the operation of phases in mental health courts. That's something that we have worked on in the state of Idaho in our development of standards and guidelines for mental health courts for a number of years, and it's something that I personally find to be a very interesting and a very useful way of, looking at how we operate and structure our mental health courts. So I am trying to advance the slide here. There we go. In this presentation, we're going to talk about kind of the theoretical foundations that are major underpinnings for the operation of mental health courts and how those interface with the development of the phases and the focus of each phase. We'll talk specifically about 4 phases. We will then talk about, Eric especially will get into kind of the application of the phases, what goes on in each phase, the specific objectives and tasks that are carried out in each phase, and how you can tell, how you can move people effectively from one phase to another. At the end, we will have some time for questions and answers, and hopefully we'll be able to get to all of the things that you're particularly interested in. So in talking about the theoretical foundations, for me, there are 4 primary areas of consideration. There's operating within the risk-need responsivity model of effective intervention for individuals in criminal justice, often referred to as RNR for risk, need, and responsivity. We know that individuals, and particularly in our courts, our focus in Idaho has been on serving high-risk, high-need individuals. These are people primarily with felony offenses. They are individuals with some specific clinical criteria that I'll talk about, but we employ the sort of philosophy and theoretical foundation of assessing risk, of determining what individuals' criminogenic needs are, what are the needs that are really contributing to their continued involvement with law enforcement and with the criminal justice system. And then talking about responsivity. When we talk about risk, need, and responsivity in the model, often we focus a lot on risk and need. And I know Eric will talk about the, what we call the big 8 criminogenic risk factors that predispose or that are correlated with individuals' continued involvement and law-breaking behavior. We talk about needs. What are the kind of the needs that people have that are strongly influencing that behavior, and how to design treatments that will specifically address those, and why that's so important. But often we kind of give responsivity a little bit of a short shrift. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about today really fall very much in that realm of understanding and responding to individuals' specific responsivity needs. I'm going to talk about trauma-responsive approaches, and I think we've all heard a lot about, trauma-informed care, about the importance of understanding the impact of trauma. Trauma-responsive approaches are a key element of addressing people's risk and needs through the lens of their particular responsivity. Also want to talk about procedural justice or procedural fairness. This is a body of research that indicates that if individuals believe or perceive that they are treated fairly in in this case in the criminal justice system, in the court, they are much more likely to be compliant with the requirements of the court. They're more likely to follow specific orders of the court, and they're less likely to continue to be involved in offender behavior. So procedural justice or procedural fairness is really a critical element of addressing individuals' responsivity needs. Then we're going to talk a little bit about, or I want to focus a little bit on the notion of recovery. For individuals involved in the alcohol and drug substance use disorder system, the notion of recovery is a very long-standing paradigm, a very long-standing principle of treatment and rehabilitation. The notion of someone being in recovery, all of the things that are involved in that go certainly well beyond simply participating in treatment. I've said on a number of occasions lately, I remember where I was when I first heard the concept of recovery applied in the case of mental illness. It was in Seattle, Washington in 1999, and there was a woman who had come to do some training with our behavioral health system from New Zealand. And she talked a lot about the recovery model in mental health. So that's not all that long ago, 16, 17 years ago, that I even heard about the notion of recovery as it relates to mental illness and to mental health issues. That's something that she talked about, and that now SAMHSA has done a lot of work on and identified important principles in having a recovery orientation in your problem-solving court. So to kind of look at how this plays out, I like to think of one of our favorite metaphors, the three-legged stool. So to me, the three-legged stool of positive outcomes for individuals in mental health court, and certainly outcomes are what we're all trying to accomplish. It rests on employing risk, need, and responsivity. There's just a large body of evidence, and all of the research that continues to take place only reinforces that the risk, need, and responsivity aspect of problem-solving courts is, and of all really offender rehabilitation efforts, is important to employ risk, need, and responsivity understanding. But when you look at the legs of that stool, I like to see those as including trauma-responsive services and systems and approaches, the use of procedural justice, fairness, which involves a number of specific concepts and attributes, and then finally this recovery focus. And I think the recovery focus is particularly relevant to phases, because as we talk about the different phases, we understand that the ultimate outcome, the ultimate objective, is that people leave our courts, and when they do, they are very strongly connected to the community and to ongoing support in the community. So that recovery focus is part of why we even, I think, talk about the importance of phases and structure our programs into phases. So let's look just quickly, and these slides will be available to you after the presentation. These are principles that are part of the recovery principles, trauma-responsive principles, and procedural justice principles. And the ones that are highlighted in red print, those are common across those three areas. So there's a whole lot of overlap, meaning that when you are using recovery principles, you are often involved in the same things that make a program trauma responsive or that provide procedural justice. I want to talk just quickly about particularly the trauma responsive principles, we know that it's very important to initially, we know that probably in mental health courts, even to a greater extent than other problem-solving courts, individuals come to us with typically complex trauma histories. They have experienced many different kinds of trauma, often going back to early childhood, adverse childhood events, lots and lots of trauma. So to be trauma responsive is really, I think, an expectation, not an exception to how we need to organize our systems and operate. Safety being number one, how we create that sense of safety for people. Trustworthiness, meaning that individuals believe that we care about them and that we sincerely want to be helpful. Transparency, you know, in all of our problem-solving courts, we have something of a challenge to transparency in that we do a lot of work behind the scenes. We have staffings. We have ongoing regular communication about our participants. And those important aspects of mental health court, of collaborative treatment and coordinated planning and responses, create something of an issue of transparency. And so how we can go about sort of demystifying, how we can go about greater means of sharing with our participants information that we are considering in our various decision-making processes is a very important aspect of trauma-responsive efforts. Peer support, and you will see in both recovery principles and in trauma-responsive principles this aspect of peer support. I really believe that the increasing involvement of individuals like peer support specialists or recovery coaches is really going to be a game changer in terms of engaging people, retaining people, and ultimately transitioning people into an ongoing recovery in the community. Collaboration and mutuality, certainly that is a hallmark of problem-solving courts, but empowerment and voice and choice, those are really found in all of the three legs of the stool, that people have the opportunity for their desires, their goals, their voice in telling their side of the story in some cases, in setting the goals that they are going to work on. You know, we certainly have goals for them, but we increasingly need to recognize that their engagement really depends on the extent to which their goals drive some of their activities and progress in the court. Procedural justice principles, again, this issue of voice, that people have an opportunity to be heard. We do a lot of this in our court hearings with individuals, in interacting with them. We know that the role of the judge is a critical element in people feeling that they have been treated fairly and in feeling that the court is a trustworthy place and a place where they will be treated with respect. Neutrality and transparency. So we've talked a bit about transparency. There's an important aspect of neutrality that we're only beginning to deal with in the court system, and that is the issue of uncovering and becoming much more aware of our implicit biases about individuals. Fortunately, one of the ways of addressing implicit bias, which really is based on behaving on assumptions about individuals, coming from our experience or our socialization about their membership in a particular group. And one of the particular groups that we're talking about is the group of people who have been diagnosed with a mental illness. Individuals diagnosed with a mental illness, there are many assumptions that we make about them that are biases. They're not necessarily based on an individual assessment of that person. So getting to this point of addressing and understanding our biases, part of that can be helped by coming to know the participant as an individual rather than as a member of a group, whether that group be the group of offender, the group of person with mental illness, the group of person with a substance use disorder, the group being a person of a particular racial or ethnic heritage. Respect for the person and for their rights, how we interact with people communicates a sense of respectful treatment. That's very important. But also respecting and helping them to understand their rights and understand that we take their rights very seriously. And then finally, the issue of trust, that they see us as members of the team, as judges, as being caring, helpful, and ultimately being fair. So these overlapping principles really are and reflect the legs of this three-legged stool. So let's talk about phases. So we're going to talk about the theoretical foundations of the phases and what the phases really are, and then Eric is going to talk in much more detail about the particular attitudes or the activities that go on in the various phases and how you can determine movement in those phases. So phase one often is overlooked in some ways. We often think of, people come into the court and we get them started in treatment and we have lots of expectations. They participate in various kinds of treatment activities, and we think of that treatment as being kind of the starting point. But in fact, there is an important phase that, if it's done well, can help people a great deal and can really achieve a much more cost-beneficial result from the treatment that they receive. And that's the phase that we call, in our state, orientation and engagement. So in orientation, individuals come to learn what is expected of them, what the rules are, what the requirements are, what the communication channels are, and just kind of how this whole mental health court deal operates. The failure of orientation and the failure, first of all, violates that whole issue that we talked about a minute ago of transparency. Certainly, we can behaviorally direct people, and they will learn what the rules are by being punished for not following them. Some of us have had jobs like that. But if they understand what's expected of them very, very well and very clearly, while we are reinforcing that those requirements are taken seriously, then people have a much greater likelihood of making a commitment to be involved in the court. I want to talk a little for a moment about this issue of individuals who have experienced trauma. When there is a lack of understanding, when there is a failure of feeling, shall we say, safe and knowing what's expected of them. For individuals with trauma histories, often the reaction to that is defiance or aggressiveness or sort of, the old fight or flight. Well, in that case, it would be fight. In other cases, it will be flight. And so when you have people leaving the program, absconding early in the process, this may be a manifestation of that trauma, as well as an indication that people are feeling cornered and controlled and not understanding what's happening to them. So that understanding and engagement really is the issue of people coming to accept and to believe that they are involved in a program where people sincerely want to help them, seriously want to make services available, really want to hear their issues and concerns and address those. So the first phase is that of orientation, of understanding and engagement, those being the primary goals of phase one. The next phase, and as I said, Eric will talk about, how you determine moving people from one phase to the next. The next phase obviously is treatment. And in treatment, the goals and the focus is on helping people to gain tools, skills, and support. So in terms of tools and skills, how people can manage their mental health symptoms. This may be a phase of becoming stable on medication. It is a phase of beginning to be involved in group activities that focus on antisocial attitudes and values. This is a place where certain kinds of cognitive skills are developed, such as negotiation, such as problem solving, self-regulation. So a number of very specific behavioral tools that we then hope people will internalize and take with them as they continue on in the court and eventually transition out of the court and on into a more independent living within the community. I've always liked SAMHSA's kind of model or their idea of a life in the community for everyone. And really that is our ultimate goal, is a life, and I would say a pro-social life, in the community for everyone. So that brings us to this issue of support. The whole thrust of peer support is for individuals who can share their lived experience, who can identify with the experience of someone else who's just beginning in mental health court, and can help to, in some ways, interpret that into a common shared experience. Having that support, both in terms of, certainly in terms of even the orientation and engagement phase, but also critically in the treatment phase. This is where an individual who has experienced similar background manifests what recovery is. They demonstrate the resilience. They demonstrate use of the tools and the skills that we're trying to teach people. People can actually see those things in operation in the life of someone who came from where they came from, who experienced some of the things that they experienced. So the phase two then is really the kind of what you might call the active treatment phase, and the goals of that are to impart tools and skills and to connect people in a supportive way to recovery. So phase three, again, is a phase that something like orientation and engagement can often be overlooked, and that is transition. Transition to other services in the community, transition from if you will, a treatment plan to a wellness plan, a recovery plan, a life plan. This is where individuals' instrumental needs, such as improving their employment prospects. It may be a matter of improving income maintenance. It may be qualifying for long-term alcohol and drug-free housing. It's a variety of transitional activities that begin to really strengthen the connection for an individual to their community and to the resources in that community and to the relationships. It may be reconnecting with family. It may be relationships with an organized recovery support community. that could be an actual 12-step fellowship. It could be a religious organization. It could be community organizations. Whatever it is, we know that people as social beings need those relationships to be stable in the community. And we certainly have some ideas about the people with whom those relationships are not positive, other individuals with criminal behavior, other individuals with, substance use, active substance use disorders, and individuals that simply are toxic in their relationships with the individual. It's very difficult for someone to give up those relationships if there are not other relationships to take their place. So the focus of this phase is really connecting people to the supports and the resources that will enable them to live productively in the community. The final phase, phase 4, maintenance, is where people have the opportunity with a safety net, if you will, to maintain and demonstrate the tools, the skills, the recovery practices that they've established. We know that sometimes the notion of graduation from a problem-solving court can mean people feel sort of cut off. Someone described it as going over a cliff. We've had a situation of significant direction and support and encouragement and accountability to nothing, and that's pretty much a recipe for losing much of the ground that's been gained. So in maintenance, the goal is to demonstrate, is to assist people, but to step back with a safety net in place for them to live life, as we often hear, on life's terms, and to maintain their recovery practices. The end of that phase is sometimes called graduation, sometimes called completion, sometimes called commencement. Whatever you call it, it signals the end of our direct involvement with the individual, however we phase that phase to its conclusion. So these are kind of the primary phases that we believe are very important in our mental health courts. I'm going to turn it over now to Eric Olson to really talk about sort of how do you operationalize these phases? What do people do in phase 1 and phase 2? And how do you tell when they're ready to move from phase 2 to phase 3? And what's that process going to look like? So thank you for your attention. As I said, these slides will be available to you if you're interested, and I give you Eric Olson.
Okay, so I want to thank Norma and Sarah for everything they've presented so far, and we'll lead right into my trying to go into more detail. I'm pretty excited about this, actually, because we've done a lot of presentations on different things. I think this is the first one specifically on phases, so I'm pretty excited about that. To help this make more sense, I think it's important we understand our target population. We work with folks, the treatment for our court is provided by an ACT team, a forensic ACT team, assertive community treatment. So our target population is individuals that have severe mental illnesses. So schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar 1 and 2, major depressive disorder, and they also have significant functional impairment. So that's the mental health piece. We also, as Norma mentioned, work with folks with a moderate to high LSI score. Our scores actually in our mental health court, since we've been doing this, are higher when they start than any of our other problem-solving courts in our district. Our drug courts, anything else, they have the highest LSI scores in our mental health court. Most of our folks have a history of psychiatric hospitalizations. All have history of incarcerations, obviously. And most of the folks we're working with have a co-occurring substance use disorder. Typically, between the 3 courts we work with, we have one person maybe at a time that doesn't have a substance use disorder issue. So that's really common. Trauma, obviously, is huge, and we've been working to do better at that. And our folks are post-plea, post-adjudication. We have both misdemeanor and felony cases. So most of our folks are on probation. Our misdemeanor folks typically have 2 years of probation. Felony, you know, it varies, 2 to 10 years. They have a lot of time over their head. So that's kind of our target population of the folks we're working with. I bring up the central 8 risk factors. These are things that we've been trying to do much better at targeting, and we really incorporate these with our LSI scores throughout the phases as we go through. So if you're not familiar with those, I think most of you probably are. You see the commonality of antisocial in the first 4 there and all of those, so that's a big piece of what we deal with, and then we'll focus on the other 4 as we go through this. We actually have this poster on our board in our staffing room to help us remember, you know, what those risk factors are and what are some of the things that they need, just as kind of a reminder to us. We did that about a year ago. It's been interesting. It's been helping us. So I give you that just so you're aware of that. I won't mention it in a lot of places down the road, but know that a lot of the things that we've done in these phases is based on trying to target these risk factors as we go through. The reason for that, if you haven't seen this slide, I love this slide. In a nutshell, what this slide mentions is as you move from the middle to the left of this, the more criminogenic risk needs that you help your participants target and reduce their risk in those areas, the greater outcomes you're going to have. If you look to the right and we don't address any of those risk issues, their recidivism rate is going to go up. So it's important that Norma talked a lot about responsivity, and we're going to talk about that, but once you get those needs met, it's important that we help them target as many of those criminogenic risk needs as we can, because their recidivism rate really goes down as we target those. So a couple disclaimers before we get into the phases themselves. One of the things we see is you've got to individualize this. If I jump down, I already mentioned R&R is filtered through the process. If you go down to the bottom, one of the fears, I guess, of putting things in phases is that we become kind of rigid, and we develop these phase checklists, and everybody just, you know, marks them off and initials them or whatever, and pretty much everybody's doing the same thing. So I guess I would caution you as we go through this, make sure that that's not what you do by implementing a phase system. We kind of have to catch ourselves. So you'll see as we look at these phase checklists, there's some real generic things on purpose because they're things that everyone has to kind of attend to. There are also ways to be very individualized with it, and kind of each person's recovery is targeted as we go through. So I just caution you to make sure you don't make a one-size-fits-all by doing these phases. And then, obviously, make sure the expectations and responses are appropriate. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in, you know, having the same response for everybody. We really want to target our responses based on where people are in our program, you know, what's their motivation level, stage of change, those kind of things as we go through. So that's just kind of an overall disclaimer as we get going. Phase 1, what we're going to look at is this. We're going to look at, as Norma said, it's our orientation and engagement phase. So one of the things we really want to do is be intentional about what we're targeting. What that means is we're really, when people come in, you know, they come in with so many issues. A lot of them come in with nowhere to live. They're homeless. A lot of them come in with either instability on their medications or no medications, no support. Sometimes they don't have any money. Their benefits have been stopped, or if they were working, they haven't been working. Anyway, they come in with so many issues. What we really focus on is having them come in and be honest with us and start building trust with us. So we don't want to fix everything. We really want them to be able to show up, know how to get there, and we want them to trust us when we do that. Now, when we do that, we have to do certain things to reward that behavior. So, for example, we had a person come in just last week, her very first weekend, the very first thing she did show up to the UA like she was supposed to, showed up to treatment. After the UA came back positive. She didn't say anything about the UA up front, but when the probation officer talked to her about it, she was honest with him about it. So our initial response to that was simply to focus on the honesty. Would it have been great if she was honest and up front before? Sure, but she just started. So all we did is praise the honesty. So there's a lot of things like that that you want to be aware of in phase 1, but I think the most important thing is, what do you really want? We want them to show up, and we want them to build trust with us. Because if they do that, that sets us up for success as we move forward. Remember, you can't fix everything. It's orientation and engagement phase. A big piece of this in our court is welcoming, empathic, and hopeful. We really want to be recovery-focused with them and strength-focused. One of the things we find is most people are so hesitant to do that when they come in for a lot of reasons, but most of them just haven't had this kind of experience. If they have been honest, or, you know, if they get caught with EUA, they get, you know, whatever sanction is, or jail or whatever. So we want them to know that we're happy they're here. We want to help understand where they've been and what they're going through. And most of all, we want them to be hopeful for the future and know that, you know, they can reach their goals. We can help them with that. One of the things that I think has really helped us with this, and Norma mentioned it, is peer support. Having a peer support now on our staff has really helped folks to understand that, you know, they can reach their goals. They kind of meet that person right off the bat, don't really understand, you know, their role, but they can see, hey, you know, there's someone in recovery, and I'd kind of like to be like them, so to speak. As we get started, this is just kind of what we do as someone comes into our program. We sit down as a team and we review their mental health assessment, you know, so we know what symptoms they're dealing with, what medications have they been on, what medications have worked in the past, what hasn't, their family situation. We just kind of review all those pieces. A big piece that we've been trying to focus on is strengths. It's amazing to me sometimes the strengths that our folks have and the things that they're interested in that we kind of overlooked in the past. So the more we can identify those at the beginning and try to incorporate those in their treatment plan as we move through, we found we get a lot more buy-in and a lot more success in getting them to trust us. And it's fun for us because we get to know a lot of neat things about them that we were kind of overlooking before. We also review our risk assessment. So we have that central 8 risk factors kind of on our wall, and we match those up with their LSI scores and where they're high and moderate in those areas. So it's interesting because they all look quite different. They all have different things they're struggling with. There's a lot of similarities, but we try to tie those in and make sure we're aware of those issues right off the bat so we can work them in and help them work them into their treatment plan right from the get-go instead of waiting. In the past, we didn't do a lot of that until we were, you know, phase 3 or later in our program with not enough time to help them work on those things. Another key piece I think we look at right off the bat is the substance use and what's the level of it. You know, are we dealing with someone who's dependent, and we're going to have to respond differently, you know, to their uses and expect that we're going to have quite a few uses while we help them build skills? Or are they more on the abuse side of the spectrum and we need to respond differently? We want to know that right off the bat so we can respond to those things appropriately. And we also want to make sure our whole team's using MI, including our judge, everyone, that we're using with our MI. And we know that we're going to have to roll with things a lot early on. I mean, Norma mentioned there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of places to show up, they've got transportation issues, all those things to deal with. So we know early on we're in a skill building mode here, and we're going to kind of roll with any early misses or early issues that way. So Norma mentioned responsivity issues. We've got a couple things in our court. The first one is welcoming, empathic, and hopeful. The other one is meds, money, and housing. So if you think about that, when someone starts, all these things are typically unstable in their lives. So we hurry and get them into a doctor, get the meds, try to get them stabilized. Our acting is very good at that. Money and housing, we get either benefits going, or if they want to start working for work, we really used to kind of push a direction more. Now we're trying to be more recovery focused, and whatever direction they want to go, we kind of work that direction. And housing, you know, that usually takes some time to get stabilized, but we almost always have all our folks start in some transitional housing. What's interesting is, speaking of responsivity issues, if you look at those things on an LSI tied into those central 8, money almost always comes back. Financial almost always comes back very highly rated on our LSI, as well as the accommodations for housing. So those things are typically high, but they're responsivity issues. We lower them, they aren't on that central 8 that we're wanting to target. But if you don't deal with them, there's no way that we can possibly work on the antisocial pieces and the other issues, the substance abuse, family, those things. These 3 have got to be stable, kind of like a Maslow hierarchy before we get into those other issues. So I'm going to go through this a little differently. I'm not going to focus on a lot of this because there's just too much, so you'll have access to these afterwards. This is kind of what they get in their handbook. It's a phase 1 requirement. What I would like to focus on in this is kind of at the beginning where it says phase 1, 12 weeks minimum. We've got a lot of questions about how long does it take. Our phases are like that kind of for a reason, and the reason is this. Orientation and engagement, we just want them showing up and we want them being honest. We've got a few small requirements that have to be done, like they're in an MRT group, a moral recognition therapy group. They have to be through phase 3 of that, and if you know anything about MRT, it's because of those phases, and it's an honesty and a trust and accountability phase. So we want them to get through those 3. Other than that, we're mainly being very individualized with what needs to happen to get them stable and making sure we're building the trust with them. The reason we do the minimums is that some people come in and with structure, you may have seen this, some people with structure just really do well, and they have kind of this honeymoon phase, and it can really go for quite a while. But what we found is over time, we at least like the minimums to keep them so we know we can deal with those issues. I have had questions about, is the minimum too long? With our folks that have the moderate to high risk, we found that it isn't. It typically takes our folks 18 months is our average time in the program for someone to graduate. We've had a couple that have done it in a year, probably a few that have done it in a year, and with our minimum, the year is kind of the minimum time frame that you can do it. So along with the minimum requirements that are in here, time frames, they have these other things they need to accomplish. The other thing, I guess Norma mentioned this, what will happen is people will want to move immediately on the minimums, which is okay because that means they're looking forward to phase. But you want to make sure you've built some competencies in and some skill building besides just the minimums on the time frame. So as we look at this, like I said, you'll have access to this. Instead of focusing on a lot of them, I'm going to highlight a few in each phase. The reason I highlight 1 and 2 is it's about fees. So they verify and they just initial these pieces on the left as they do this, and they verify that they're current on their mental health court fees. Our mental health court fees are very minimal. Our maximum that they would pay is $35 a month. The minimum they would pay is 0, obviously, and we don't like to set them up to fail. Number 2 is the same. They all have a probation, whether it's felony or misdemeanor. They all have some fines that they're required to pay, and you can see there they have restitution, a lot of them. So if they have that, we want to make sure they're at least paying something on that if they can. So it's all individualized based on their budget and what they come in with. Some come in with some money, some don't. Mainly the reason we want to do this is that if they pay their fines and they pay on their restitution, the restitution obviously is a big deal and there's not much we can do. They need to pay that back. But a lot of times where our mental health court folks aren't making a lot of money, if they'll show consistent payments all the way through, when they get done, our judges will give them credit for everything they've paid. They'll double that amount, or they may forgive some things if they'll show that they at least, did a good faith effort and they were paying something each month. So just want to be clear why we have that. I know that's an interesting issue sometimes, but we do like them to pay somewhat. What we do with the mental health court fees they pay is we actually give that back to them in incentives. We use what money we do get there to help them with incentives in our court. The other things in phase 1 that we focus on, strengths again, number 9, we identify strengths and we want to share those with the team and we want to try and incorporate those in the treatment plan. Obviously, number 10, housing is big. They're going to come in homeless most of the time, so we get them linked to housing options, at least get that started. And then the financial stability. Some of them, whatever they want to do. If they have benefits, we help them get those reinstated. If they don't, and they want to apply, we'll work them through that process. Or if they want to work, we've got a voc rehab counselor as part of our team, and we can use them. So really, whatever their goal is to get things stabilized financially, that's what we'll help work with them on. Number 12, medications. Obviously, the meds, money, and housing, it's big. We really want this to be stable as best we can, particularly going into phase 2, where we're going to work on a lot of the cognitive behavioral pieces. They've already been doing that now in 1, but we really want to make sure we've got that as stable as we can going into phase 2. And then number 14 is we have a team meeting with our treatment, probation, any other supports they have, and we do this at each phase at the end. We call it a phase-up meeting. So I think the next slide kind of describes this. What we do is we have them come in, we have them bring their probation officers there and their treatment folks, and any support people that they'd like to attend. Now what's interesting is typically at this point at phase 1, they don't bring anybody, or they can identify some family members, maybe. A lot of their family members are kind of burnt out, but we want them to bring any support folks in, and we just kind of review with them how phase 1 went for them. What are the things that they have worked on? What are the things that they've learned, those kind of things. And then we do introduce the LSI issues to them. Now, we do it in a very generic and nonspecific way, but we do have their LSI score there, and their probation officer will say, you know, you're high on these areas. We kind of generically go over what that means to them and say, you know, if you reduce in these areas, you have a greater chance of not getting back in the system, which is typically a goal for a lot of them. So we do this at each phase. We've only been doing this for, I'd say, a little over a year. We wondered kind of how that would play out. What we found is typically this first one, they don't think much of it, but they've really kind of gotten into it, and they will actually come back in the later phases and say, oh, yeah, I know we talked about this, and this is what I've done in this area, be it, you know, their housing, be it their, you know, substance abuse stuff, associations with a lot of it. But we do that at each phase kind of as a way to deal with any issues and make sure there's nothing that we haven't addressed that needs to come up before we dump them into the next phase. So that's kind of phase one, those minimum 12 weeks, and then, you know, making sure they're kind of engaged in treatment. As we go into phase two, that's our intensive treatment phase. It's a little bit longer than the others. And this is where we really get into individualized skill building. So they will have all of their main treatment groups started in phase one, but the DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy, MRT, there's a lot of things that they could be involved in just based on their treatment plan. So Norma mentioned trauma. We have trauma groups that are gender specific for men and women that they'll participate in this if they've got trauma issues. We've got different breakouts if they have anger management issues. We've got some that have a lot of stealing issues. We've got some little pamphlets that they work on if they, you know, have petty theft issues, those kind of issues, whatever their issue is, we're going to really target it here and be specific to their needs. So some of them are in all of our groups. For example, they're all going to be in the moral recognition therapy group based on their high LSI issues. But other than that, it just kind of depends on what their issues are. We've got substance abuse groups, DBT, all those different things that are available. So you can see here, phase two, we have the minimum 14 weeks. It's a little bit longer. I wouldn't mind actually if it were even longer than that. It's only 2 weeks longer than our other phases, but seems to be working for us so far. You'll get a copy of that. It's pretty generic. Some of this stuff is pretty similar as we go through these checklists. I'll go pretty quickly because the first 4 or 5 are very similar. They just adjust the amount of times they check in with like their probation officer, and their curfew adjusts as we go through. So one of the things that happens is they move through the amount of home visits they get in phase one is obviously more than it's going to be on phase 4. The amount of times they check in with their probation officer, each phase that drops back 1, how many times they meet with them a month. So that's what the first part of these checklists kind of describe. These 6 through 9 kind of describe the main things that we focus on. So they're going to learn more about their mental health substance abuse diagnosis. Will really help them focus, and depending on what their issues are as far as use or dependence is how we respond there. They'll go through trauma treatments. You can see in number 7, MRT, DBT, overcoming addictions. We do have them write kind of a paragraph on some of those things. There's a wellness recovery action plan, a RAP group. We have them kind of write that and review that with treatment to make sure they're understanding. We'd love at this phase to have a support person, as you see in number 8, that they can link to. Now, sometimes that's different for each one of them. Sometimes it's our peer support specialist. Some of them actually like the NA and AA culture and kind of get involved there. In one of our areas, we have a religious affiliation, and there's a guy that does a non-affiliated group where they just talk about spiritual things there, and they can go to that. We don't mandate really anything in this area other than you find whatever your interest is. You find some support people in the community and start to get tied to those here in phase 2. Number 9, learn how to cope with triggers of substance abuse. That's pretty big. We realize if they're dependent, at least at this point, we'll have had them for several months. We want to be seeing if they're dependent. We want to start seeing some significant use of skills on their part at this time. So we want them, we'll have moved beyond honesty, you know, with our substance use, and we want them using skills, demonstrating skills, and we really build that. So we do a lot in this phase 2, a lot of contingency management, and each time we do that, there's kind of a sanction held over their head if they've broken a rule, but really that sanction goes away if they've built skills. So we really do a lot of skill building, and that's really our focus in this phase. because beyond this, we want them demonstrating that they can use those skills as they move forward. Last couple in there, importance of relationships in your life and issues that apply to recovery. Relationships are big, as you know. It's hard. One of the hardest things for our folks is to build new relationships with people, especially when a lot of times the issues in there that they're having trouble with are family related. So we do a lot of extra meetings with that. We can link them to marriage and family therapists as part of our team, but a lot of times we'll have meetings with their family members at this point in phase 2. We want to really work through there, and sometimes it's mending those relationships for them and rebuilding, those relationships. Sometimes it's, learning to set good boundaries for them and learning how to move forward. So just really depends on what they want, but we need to move forward in those in phase 2. Then number 17, again, we'll have that phase-up meeting with each one of them as we move into 3. 3, as Norma mentioned, is more of a community transition. We're trying to get them to be thinking about moving on now from the court. We've typically in phase 2 got a lot of stability in the sense that they've got skills that they're using and developing, and we want to move them forward off of kind of reliance on our team helping them build skills into individual supports for their recovery. In phase 3, they'll do a RAP plan, a Wellness Recovery Action Plan, and we kind of look at that with them and try to target anything that we've missed so far. In the past, we used to get to this point almost always and realize we hadn't dealt with any of their trauma issues. So this is where we kind of want to tie into that. One of the things that I would like to mention here to note is we had a gal that came into our program in phase 1, and a lot of times your trauma stuff you'll know about it early on, and then it kind of gets, it kind of gets hidden away until later. She's a gal that came in when I mentioned in phase 1, and we reviewed all of her history and mental health history and trauma. In another state, when she had come in, we realized this trauma that she'd had, and she'd actually had significant spousal abuse upon her and her family, and her kids had been lit on fire by her ex. So she worked through that. We thought she was doing pretty good. What turned out to be kind of a honeymoon phase, what really triggered it is she was in our transitional housing, and it was phase 3 when she actually started moving into her own home, and all those things came up again. And what had happened is that the last time that she'd been living on her own is when that trauma had taken place. So it's really important here to, kind of go at their speed and their pace and realize that some of those things that you try to target along the way, they're going to come up, when they come up for them. Anyway, as we move further into phase 3, we got the 12-week minimum again. Again, this first page a lot of time is just, if you'll see in number 5, the amount of times they attend court, the amount of times they meet with their probation officer, those kinds of things. This is the checklist that they'll fill out. They get that first part at the beginning, then they get the checklist. In phase 3, 7 and 8, we want them to be wrapping up a lot of their groups. Ideally, any of the treatment groups that they're in, we'd like them to wrap up while they're in phase 3. Now, some of our folks take them multiple times. Some of our substance abuse groups, overcoming addictions and DBT, some of them go through those a couple times. We'd really like those to wrap up in this phase. We really want the support person, as you see in number 8, to be pretty solid. And when we have the phase-up meeting, we want to make sure we've got them there. 13, importance of medications in recovery. I guess one of the things not to forget about, we talked about meds, money, and housing right off the bat. That's a continual thing that we need to work on. As you well know, some of our folks get pretty good buy-in to their medications, but a lot of them, that's an ongoing process. And some of them are still not bought in at this point. It's, do my medications help me? Do they not? They're still dealing with side effects. So we continually work on that issue as we move through. We want to make sure we're continually addressing that. The last one on this, and I'll develop healthy pleasures during this phase. We really want this to happen. This is one of the hardest things, along with associations and making new friends, that they deal with. But we really want to help them do that, whether it's, fishing. A lot of our folks recently, what they've done that they've liked a lot as far as a healthy pleasure is they've actually gone through our peer support training, and we have a mentor program. So they've started some of that as far as being able to, interact with folks differently. But we really tie this also back into their strengths. What are they interested in and what are they good at? Now, as we move into 4A, we've split 4 into 2 phases. We have phase 4A and phase 4B. So typically this is maintenance. We want their aftercare plan to be in place, and that's based off their RAP plan, that Wellness Recovery Action Plan that they've developed in Phase 3. So they may have to finish that a little bit in 4, but pretty much we want them working that. So we want them to just go show their stuff and let us know that they've got the skills to do it. Some of the things that we'll look at, if you notice there, we've got it developed into it's a 12-week minimum, that it's 3 to 6 weeks in Phase A and 3 to 6 weeks minimum in Phase B. What we do want them working on here is that continued care plan, that RAP plan. We want to make sure it's in place and they know how to use it, not just something that, sits on their shelf. And then 8 through 13, these are the big ones, that support person and whatever they're going to be involved in with recovery moving forward. We really want to just cover our bases again, back to the meds, money, and housing. Make sure that housing's stable, the finances are stable, whether they're working or whatever they're doing, and then the family and the other supports to make sure they're in place. And here we'll actually do an exit interview at this time, and we do that mainly to get good feedback from them and try to figure out not only is there anything we've missed, but what can we do, kind of moving forward to improve our program. So we get a lot of our program improvement information right there. Now, as we go into B, this is, again, the continued care. They work the RAP plan. We reassure them that they can do it. A lot of them get kind of cold feet at this point. But what we want to be at this point, we want to have whatever their treatment's going to be beyond mental health court, we need to have it in place. Some of them have moved on to where they're confident enough dealing with the meds that they're going to go into like a med-only piece at our mental health center. Some of them have moved on to private providers. We typically do that in Phase 4A, and in 4B, we just let them do all that. So at this point, we're kind of like those blown-up little tubes you put in the bowling alley so they don't roll a gutter ball. We just kind of want to let them go and do their thing. Let's see. A piece I want to talk about here, I just want to see if it isn't highlighted on there. So let me back up here. They're going to do their continued care plan. They don't come to court at all in Phase 4. So we really want this to look like what it's going to look like beyond court. They don't come to court. Only UAs that they have is random. If the PO, wants to do one, they can do one. And typically they do. A lot of times we'll have participants, if they really struggled early on with substance abuse, they've really become kind of reliant on those UAs helping them stay clean. So we want to help them gain the confidence and skills to do that as they move forward. Now, one of the things I just did want to bring up here is that buy-in with medications. We've had a few folks that even get to this point and they're like, you know what, we're going to not buy into these meds, we're going to go off as soon as we're done. If we do that, we've typically, if we haven't got to them at this point, then they're pretty much going to try that. We've had them try that at this stage while they're still in our court with our doctor and kind of manage that at this level. We've had it happen, not a lot of times, but I want to say about 4 times. 3 of the 4 times it worked out kind of as we predicted, and we were able to kind of wrap around them and they could kind of see that, I do need these medications, and it actually worked out well. But we've kind of wanted to do that at this stage rather than them, saying, I'm going to go off, well, you got to stay on during the program, then they go off, then you have immediate, kind of bombshell and things don't go well after. So we kind of want to be aware of that as we move forward. Graduation requirements, these are just kind of in their handbook as they move forward. We've covered everything in here, so we review this with them as we get in the latter phases to make sure they've got all those things done. You'll get a copy of that slide. Really, that's kind of, I guess, the end of where I was going. That's kind of the detail of how we do it. So I guess I would throw it back to maybe Olivia to see if we have any questions or if there's anything that we can clarify.
Great, thank you so much. There actually are a number of questions, and one thing that I just wanted to say again is that this webinar is being recorded, and the webinar slides as well as a copy of the Bonneville Mental Health Court Handbook will be available on our website shortly after this webinar. So the first question was on mental health courts following the same rules and regulations, and I think this is a twofold question, one of which I can address and one of which I will pass to Eric and Norma to answer. So first off, the Bonneville Mental Health Court does have their own standards, and they do follow state standards that were developed in Idaho. Many other mental health courts that we work with do have multiple phase programs. Some of the phases can be similar to what Bonneville has. The engagement type phase often is a common theme, and many of the phases are based on being in treatment, and as they move through treatment, stabilization, and moving towards more recovery supports and completion type phases. But it does vary across jurisdictions. Some states have standards and some states do not, as far as the requirements for a mental health court. So a lot of this is jurisdiction specific. We're just giving this as a concrete example of a jurisdiction that has a handbook and standards as well as state standards. So the piece that I did want to pass to Norma and Eric is, so how do the state standard actually fit into the practices and the standards that you're following for your phases?
Eric, do you want to take that?
Sure. So I think I understand the question. So we actually go right by the standards. I mean, our standards, the state standards that we've developed, we've implemented them right into what we do. So everything we're doing there is in compliance with the state standards that we have and we developed. Norma and I actually were on a committee that helped develop those. So I'm not sure if I'm answering that right, Olivia, but they go right along with. So we're not varying from anything that we don't have in our state standards. Is that the right, am I answering the right question?
Yes, I think so. And I think Idaho's state standards actually are more specific than a lot of other state standards. There's specifications around ACT team as a provision of care, and there actually is some specification around phases. So it does differ from many other state standard approaches.
Yep, that would be correct.
So that's important background information for everyone as well. So the next question is actually around best practices for performance measures for a mental health court. And we actually have resources available on the CSG Justice Center website. We have a database available that has some standards for mental health court data collection as well as some webinars on this topic. But Eric and Norma, from your perspective, what do you feel like is important to consider when developing performance measures and within your standards for the courts?
Okay, so what if I try, Norma, and you can correct me?
Okay, I'd be glad to.
I'll tell you what we started with. Here was kind of our experience. When we started, and we were the first mental health court in Idaho, we focused on a couple things. We focused on reducing psychiatric hospitalizations, mainly because we wanted that for our participants, and we knew it was probably the biggest cost-saving that we could provide. We also focused on reducing incarceration. So those were the main two things that we focused on. We found that after we were doing that, we actually did a little study a couple years in, and we'd reduced with the group we were working with the psychiatric hospitalizations like 98% and the incarcerations 90%. So we focused on those for a couple reasons. One, the cost savings piece because they were so big, and two, because they were really easy to track. As we moved along, we have focused, one of the biggest things I think is recidivism. So all the commissioners, legislators, they want to know that we're making headway that way. So we have focused on that. I will tell you this. We started with really big dreams, and I think it's awesome if you can track them, but we started with a database that tracked housing and employment and, their how they were doing with their symptoms, symptom reduction, all of those things. And what we found was it was really great when we first started, and then as we grew, it became really difficult for us to manage those things. So we tried to narrow things down and focus on things that were very measurable. Now we have the LSI score into that, things that are measurable, that we can show results from our program along with, stories of how well people are doing. But we focused on 3 or 4 main things instead of a bunch of things. Norma, you want to add to that?
The only thing I would add is the issue of retention and graduation rates. You know, how many people are actually, who start the program, are able to stay in the program and reach the point where they're considered to have completed the program. And we have across the state a fair amount of variation in that rate. And that's why I'm particularly passionate, I guess I should say, about the issues of trauma-responsive care, of procedural fairness, and the recovery principles. That I don't think that it's great when your graduates do very well, but if you don't have a very strong graduation rate, then I think you need to look at the structure of your program and be concerned about that. I think, you know, across problem-solving courts, sometimes we're a little complacent about what is an adequate completion rate. And I certainly think that anything less than half, you know, less than 50% is an indication that you should be looking at what's going on. And I know it's never going to be 100% because they're, you know, 100% would be indicative of, you know, maybe not being either serious about certain kinds of acceptable progress and behavior, or it may be indicative that you're taking people who are pretty low risk, and that would also be an issue.
Yeah, the other thing I would add is for those that aren't completing, we really recommend to all of the grantees we work with that you track why people aren't completing, because then you might get more information on if there are gaps, like Norma mentioned on the trauma piece, if there are gaps like that, or if it's specific diagnoses that are having more trouble in your court, or if it's based on, you know, technical violations. So you can get a lot of information from also tracking why people are unable to complete your program in order to make improvements within your program.
I think that's a great point.
Olivia, could I just add one piece to that? Because I think those are both excellent points. And one of the things we do is quarterly, we have a meeting and we pull some of the data, just like you mentioned. Like we'll pull our graduation rates, recidivism rates, and then we'll run different queries on them. Like we'll compare, you know, folks that we work with a bipolar disorder versus someone that had a diagnosis of schizophrenia versus major depression. And we try to do those things quarterly just to kind of see if there's trends or things that we're missing, or, you know, things that can make us improve. So I think that's important also.
Definitely. Okay, there's a couple of questions that are specific to the Bonneville court. And so Eric, maybe you can just cover both of them. One is based upon what's your recidivism rate, and the other is based upon the assessment tools that you specifically use in Bonneville.
Okay. So the first one is we try to track recidivism and look at it, like I said, quarterly. I'll just share an interesting piece here before I give you the actual number, but this is about 2 or 3 years ago now. Our prosecutor, who's now one of our judges, in the prosecutor's office, they had, I don't know that it was as much tied to mental health courts, I think it was problem-solving courts in general, particularly drug court. You know, the rumor goes around these things aren't really working. So drug court actually didn't have a recidivism rate locally that they could give them, but we had one for mental health court. So he ran one, the prosecutor's office actually ran a recidivism study of their own and kind of compared several of the problem-solving courts that we have here, our felony drug courts, misdemeanor drug courts, those kind of things. Long story short, ours was the lowest recidivism rate of any of them that he ran, so that was good for us. I believe at the time his number was 21% was our recidivism rate with our graduates. Now, one of the things that we like to do also is we try to run, when we run our recidivism, we also run it in, like the folks that have terminated from our program, we run theirs also to see if we're making any headway that way. So anyway, that was what our recidivism rate was. It stayed about that. It's varied from between about 18 to 25% is what it has been each time we check it. As far as assessment tools that we use, in Idaho we have a statewide they call it a common mental health assessment that they all use. So every ACT team across the state does that. And it's a, kind of a psychosocial assessment that covers many areas and then comes out with diagnostic, instruments at the end. So we get a diagnosis. We also use the GAIN for substance abuse statewide, and then statewide in our misdemeanor and felony probation, they do an LSI. So those are typically the things that we have coming in. We have the mental health assessment, a GAIN, and that LSI score to help. Those are the three main assessment tools that we use. Our ACT team has developed, specific things that they do in regards to trauma, but it's more locally. It's nothing that's standardized statewide.
Great, thank you. We also had a question around peer support. They indicated that, in some jurisdictions, they're unavailable to use peer support of individuals who have a criminal history for their programs. Do you have suggestions to help with this issue? Or, what do you feel like peer support is able to bring to your program?
Let me say one thing about that. One of the things that we have in Idaho is a waiver process to case-by-case look at specific individuals and what their criminal history is and what their sort of recovery and treatment history is. And so we are able to have a waiver of the otherwise exclusionary backgrounds for some people. We're negotiating really with the funder under our Medicaid program right now to accept that. So there's a belief that Medicaid rules, federal regulations, preclude individuals with criminal histories. And I would encourage anyone whose program is is finding that barrier to look more deeply at that. It really is focused, and the emphasis is on the kinds of criminal histories that impact Medicaid fraud. And it's really not the blanket criminal history exclusion that often is believed to be. So the state of New York has done a lot of work in that area. So I would encourage anyone who's looking at that concern. When we talk about mental health court and peer support and lived experience, if a person has had no experience with the criminal justice system, they're really not a peer. And so that's, excluding individuals from that, on that basis, I think is short-sighted, and I think programs need to be looking at how to address that particular barrier. We've certainly had great results for individuals, and when we use peer support in the courts that don't rely on being able to be reimbursed by Medicaid, we're able to use individuals with a criminal history. And of course, we look at what it is and what their recovery is, and but we don't overall automatically exclude individuals with a prior criminal record.
All I would add to that, Olivia, I think Norma answered that extremely well. Just to the piece of how it actually plays out in the specific courts, it's just such a fabulous resource. They are looked at differently than the traditional counselors or social workers or professionals we deal with. So they have a different relationship. They have different things that they can do. It's just extremely beneficial. I would say one of the biggest benefits is having worked in the courts and you've seen that person from when they started with you and graduate and now become a peer support specialist, the confidence and the change in them and their overall life from when they started, being able to actually be employed, and get that reinforcement of, I'm employable and I can work in this field and be a professional. It's just so inspiring, I guess, for not only the other participants, but for us to see those overall changes. It's fabulous.
I'd like to echo that. I think, we think about the impact that having peer support has on our participants, but it also has a huge impact on our staff, on the members of the team. We often talk about optimism and hope and so forth, but as professionals, we're as captive to history as everybody else, and we don't, we're often talking about things we don't completely believe in ourselves, and the example that is set by individuals with positive recovery is a huge benefit.
Thank you. So the next question is, if you work in an area that does not have a mental health court, what is the best way to establish one, or at least begin a dialogue about its importance? And I think I can field this, and then if you have anything to add, feel free. So I think this is a great question. A lot of jurisdictions on the line are probably at this point, and there's numerous diversion options available for communities to utilize. The resource I mentioned earlier of the developing a mental health court and interdisciplinary curriculum actually has videos that walks you through the process, and you can use it within your jurisdiction to decide if a mental health court is the right option for you. So I think that is a great resource. So I would encourage you to look at that. There's videos of national experts talking about different topics. There's packets and workbooks to complete that actually aid in the process of what are the major questions you should be asking to see if this is really what's needed in your jurisdiction, if this is what would best serve your population.
The one thing I would add to that, based on our experience and also people I've talked to in other states, the more we have emphasized the importance of this model, and when I'm talking about the model, I'm really talking about the problem-solving court model that addresses high-risk, high-need individuals. It's really, seldom a diversion strategy for the most part. And the more you do that, the more you tend to be dealing in a post-conviction problem-solving court structure. So it's much more difficult to get prosecutors, if you're talking truly high-risk, high-need people, to get prosecutors or the community, for that matter, to be comfortable with such people being in a diversion court. So typically in our state, the vast majority of individuals in our mental health courts have been sentenced, they have been found guilty, they've been sentenced, they are on probation, and as a part of that probation are participating in a mental health court. Sometimes they're individuals who weren't involved in a mental health court initially in probationary status, but as they have violated probation, which is often the circumstance for individuals with significant mental illness and often co-occurring substance use disorders, don't always do that well on probation. With standard probationary, programs, they can be referred to mental health court and get that additional accountability, additional focus on treatment and structure.
Thank you, and this actually leads perfectly into, I think, what will probably be our last question, is what types of sanctions do you use in your mental health court? The individual who asked this is just starting the program and more familiar with drug court sanctions. So if you're able to address a little bit about some of the differences in what you might use in a mental health court versus a drug court, that might be helpful as well.
Okay.
I'd like to make one comment about that, and that is, and in my mind, it's not really different than drug court, and that is that rewards are way more important than sanctions. And, we often get so hung up on sanctions that we forget how important rewards are. And that takes us back to that very first orientation phase. And Eric mentioned it, that, you know, you get certain behavior and you reward it, you praise it, you positively acknowledge it from the very beginning, and you do that, you know, as much as possible, so that you shift the focus from this belief that sanctions are what changes behavior, because sanctions really do not change behavior other than in a very short-term way. Having said that, I'll turn it to Eric, because certainly, you know, sanctions are a part of the program.
Yeah, so that's well said, Norma. I think there's similarities and I think there's differences, obviously. I think one of the things that we've learned is, you know, if you have someone that comes in with and they're dependent on, you know, meth, or they're dependent on a substance, some of those same principles that apply in drug court as far as how you should respond to that, those things typically apply in mental health court as well. I think what you've got to be aware of is the responsivity issues, and make sure, you know, we've got them stable and those kind of things. But we'll typically target things very similarly. So if they're coming in and they're using right off the bat and they're dependent, we know it's going to be a long-term goal to get them clean. We're not going to sanction. We're going to reward, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to reward honesty, we're going to reward showing up, and we're going to build on that. So our expectation the next time may be, okay, now we'd like you to come in and be honest before you give the UA instead of waiting until after. You know, and they're going to test that. If they do that and you still sanction them, then you just, you know, destroyed the trust you were trying to build. So I think what's important is having your whole team be aware and on the same page with that, because if you've got some team members that aren't on board with that approach, it's not going to work. The other thing I think that we typically do differently, at least in our local drug courts here, we do a lot more contingency management. So I believe that it's important to have an immediate response. Sometimes our immediate response, though, will be, hey, you've earned this sanction, and we'll use everything. We use jail if we need to. We've used community service, but we try to do a lot more rewarding and a lot more skill building. So we may say, okay, you've earned, you know, 10 hours community service, but if you'll do this contingency plan with us, then you can earn your way out of that. And we'll do a contingency plan with them where they sit down with a counselor and go over what was the issue, whether it was a, you know, a missed group or whatever they missed that earned them the consequence, and we'll help them work out a plan to build those skills. And if they'll typically do that for a week, the longest we'll do it is 2 weeks, they can earn their way out of those sanctions. So we do a lot of contingency management that way. But we have a lot of the same discussions that I would assume drug courts are having is, you know, are these non-compliant issues or non-responsive issues? And if they're non-responsive, you know, that's on us, and we need to be building skills. Sometimes they are, you know, non-compliant, and they'll earn a jail sanction. But, you know, similar to drug court, I think, we typically do it very briefly and try to move forward and be more skills-focused. So I agree with Norma. It's kind of that fine line. There's some similarities, and some of the principles are the same. I just think there's a lot more skill building and a lot more responsivity that you need to be aware of.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And I think we are about out of time here. So I really want to thank Norma Jaeger and Eric Olson for providing information on phases in mental health courts in Bonneville and in Idaho. This is part of a series of webinars brought to you by the Criminal Justice and Mental Health Court Learning Sites, and we're planning to do these webinars quarterly. So please look for additional opportunities to learn more about some of the other learning site programs in the next quarter. So thank you. Have a great day.